Debate, the honourable member for Parkdale-High Park.
Here, here. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to be able to speak to the motion of my colleague from Scarborough Rouge River, and I want to thank her for all her work on eliminating child poverty, which is the subject of the motion we're dealing with today. And because this is the second hour of debate, I'd like to make reference to the actual content of the motion, and that is that the federal government should work in collaboration with the provinces, territories, and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities to eradicate child poverty in Canada by developing a national poverty reduction plan that includes A, making housing more affordable for lower-income Canadians, B, ensuring accessible and affordable childcare, C, addressing child nutrition, D, improving economic security of families, E, measures that specifically address the unique needs of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, and F, measurable targets and timelines. In other words, accountability. Mr. Speaker, it has been 25 years since Ed Broadbent's motion aimed at ending child poverty unanimously passed in this House, and yet successive Conservative and Liberal governments have failed to act on this promise. With almost 1 million children living in poverty, almost half of whom are Indigenous, surely it is time to end child poverty. Professor David Holchansky, who is a constituent of mine, a professor in Toronto, has documented very precisely what is happening with the declining middle class and the growing polarization in our city, in Toronto. He calls it a three-city situation where some at the very top are getting more wealthy, an increasing shrinking group are staying about the same, but a growing number of people are falling further and further behind. Now, childhood poverty is costly, not only obviously for the children affected, costly in terms of their childhood experience of inequality, but also costly in terms of lost potential and social costs. I should point out Canada ranks 23rd among countries in the OECD, a shameful record. We want to set records, but not this one, surely. 1 out of 7 children in Canada lives in poverty, but if you are born Aboriginal, you have a 2 out of 5 chance of living in poverty. Shameful, shameful numbers. Now, UNICEF Canada has written a report, and they recommend creating a children's commissioner and making the UN Convention on Child Poverty enforceable in court. Now, Canada has ratified this international agreement in 1991, but progress remains very, very slow and very spotty. Now, this UNICEF report makes a number of recommendations, and they're worth noting. As I said, make the convention enforceable in courts, but also they recommend develop a national action plan aimed at bringing Canada into the UN Convention compliance. Hold a parliamentary review of the recommendations from the UN Committee on Child Rights and from the Senate report on children, and to include everyone under 18 under child protection legislation, and also to develop a program to educate children and others on the Convention rights. Now, I'd like to speak specifically to the sub-elements of this motion. First of all, dealing with affordable housing. And Mr. Speaker, there is an alarming situation taking place now when it comes to the lack of affordable housing. There are 92,000 people in Toronto on the wait list for housing. In my community, in Parkdale-High Park, we see families who have to make the gut-wrenching decision, do they pay their rent or put food on the table? They're going to keep a roof over their head, and therefore we have community kitchens and food banks bursting at the seams, a number of children who go to school hungry every day. This is shocking in a city as wealthy as Toronto. I see families with 2, sometimes 3 kids, and they're living in a 1-bedroom apartment because that's all they can afford. And I see people living in Toronto community housing living in very substandard housing with serious maintenance problems, mold, water leakage, appliances that don't work. There are buildings in our community where the elevators don't work, Mr. Speaker. So we have serious problems, and also we have problems with a lack of effective rent control legislation where companies get around the legislation, they get people out of the buildings and jack up the rents, and the upshot is people can't afford to find a decent place to live, and there is an explosion of new homes being built, but they're mainly condos, private condos. Well, low-income people don't have the ability to buy these condos, and there's no affordable housing being built for them. Also, we have a problem with co-ops that are finishing their housing agreements, and these are not going to be renewed. So we have people who are getting a subsidy, who were able to live in a decent place, a cooperative housing development, because they got a bit of a subsidy, and those subsidies will be lost. And that's a huge dilemma for many in the city of Toronto. Unfortunately, the Conservatives have abandoned their social housing responsibilities. 1 in 4 Canadian households, that's 1.5 million Canadians, families and individuals spend more than a third of their income on housing. And Canada is the only G8 country without a strategy on affordable housing. And of course, it was under the previous Liberal government where the National Housing Plan was abandoned. And it's shocking, Mr. Speaker, in a northern country with such high needs that we don't have effective housing or even a plan to get to that housing. Early childhood education, when it comes to public spending on childcare and early learning, Canada ranks last among developed and comparable countries. For years, Liberal and Conservative governments have ignored this pressing need for Canadian families. There are over 900,000 kids in need of care in Canada with no access to quality, affordable childcare spaces. The Conservatives promised 125,000 new spaces, but just like the Liberals, they didn't create one single space. And I know in my community, childcare spaces can run up to $2,000 per month per child, clearly far out of the reach of most families. But what noted economist Pierre Fortin has said that Quebec's model of childcare, affordable, accessible, high quality, has allowed more than 70,000 mothers to be able to join the workforce and generates a return of $1.75 for every dollar spent on childcare. Clearly an important investment. Well, when it comes to Indigenous children, they're the fastest growing demographic in our country, and investments made to reduce Indigenous child poverty would have huge benefits for Canada. We have alarming rates of poverty, huge housing problems. Even Mike Holmes is saying we have to build better quality houses for Indigenous communities. It would be a better investment, more cost effective. And of course, they also face huge food security issues, as far more so than people do in the South. Mr. Speaker, I remember noted Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, in answer to a question, what's the best thing Canada can do to create innovation, to boost our economy, to boost competitiveness and job creation? His answer, invest in children. Invest in childcare, invest in post-secondary education, invest in kids. That's your best bet for a strong, innovative economy. Mr. Speaker, we want the federal government to make the elimination of child poverty a priority. We need to develop an anti-poverty plan with timelines and measurable benchmarks that would include the key components of taking on the crisis of poverty for Indigenous children, making housing more affordable for lower-income Canadians, creating an early childhood and childcare education program, addressing childhood nutrition, and improving the overall economic security of Canada. We owe Canadians no less. It is our duty as parliamentarians to act. We should all be supporting this important motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.